There is a silence in war that is more terrifying than the roar of cannons. It is the silence of the unknown. The silence of a trap waiting to snap shut. On the night of Halloween, 1950, the American army was sleeping in that silence. They were the victors. They were the conquerors. They were the men of the 1st Cavalry Division, the pride of the United States military, and they believed, with all their hearts, that the war was over. They believed they would be home by Christmas. They were wrong. This is the story of the day the world changed. The day the sleeping dragon awoke. The day history turned on a dime, in a frozen, desolate valley called Unsan. To understand the horror of that night, we must first understand the intoxication of the days before. It was late October. The North Korean army had been shattered. General Douglas MacArthur, a titan of warfare, had launched his masterstroke at Incheon and driven the enemy to the very edge of the map. The American troops were racing north, driving their trucks fast along the dirt roads, kicking up clouds of autumn dust. The air was crisp. The mood was electric. They were chasing the remnants of a broken army toward the Yalu River, the border with China. They felt invincible.
Yes, sir.
They had air superiority. They had tanks. They had the momentum of destiny. But arrogance is a blinding mist. While the generals in Tokyo looked at their maps and saw open roads, the soldiers on the ground began to feel something else. They felt eyes watching them. High above, in the jagged, snow-dusted peaks of the mountain ranges, something was moving. Not a broken army. Not a retreating rabble. But a phantom force. 300,000 men. The Chinese People's Volunteer Army. They had crossed the river in secret. They moved only at night, under the cover of darkness, freezing in the bitter cold to avoid the American airplanes. They were masters of camouflage. They were disciplined. And they were waiting. The trap was set at Unsan. Unsan was not a fortress. It was a bowl. A valley surrounded by high ground on all sides. The American 8th Cavalry Regiment drove straight into the center of this bowl. They parked their tanks. They set up their command posts. They were the spearhead of the United Nations advance. But a spearhead is only as strong as the shaft that pushes it. And on the flanks, to the west and the east, the American lines were held by South Korean units. These men were brave, but they were exhausted, under-equipped, and stretched too thin. The Chinese commander, Peng Dehuai, saw this. He did not look at the American strength. He looked at the American weakness. He decided he would not strike the steel head of the spear. He would break the shaft. He would peel away the protection, isolate the Americans, and then, when the sun went down, he would devour them. The afternoon of November 1st began with an eerie tension. The temperature dropped. The wind began to howl through the valley, carrying with it the scent of snow and smoke. Reports began to trickle in. Strange soldiers. Men speaking a different language. Attacks on the road behind them. But the command post ignored the warning signs. They could not believe, or perhaps they refused to believe, that China had entered the war in force. It was a denial born of hubris. And then, as the light began to fade, the dam broke. It started on the flanks. The Chinese 39th Army unleashed a human avalanche. They did not attack in a straight line. They flowed like water. They moved through the ravines, over the ridges, infiltrating the gaps between the South Korean units. The fighting was fierce, but short. The South Korean lines didn't just bend. They evaporated. In a matter of hours, the protective walls on the left and right of the American forces were gone. The 8th Cavalry was now alone. They were an island in a sea of red. But they didn't fully realize it yet. The sun dipped below the horizon. The shadows stretched long and black across the valley floor. The cold became a physical weight, pressing down on every man. They dug their foxholes a little deeper. They checked their ammunition. They waited. Night fell. a darkness so absolute it felt like a shroud. And then, the sound came. It wasn't the sound of artillery. It wasn't the rumble of tanks. It was music. Eerie, terrifying music. The sound of bugles blowing sharp, discordant notes in the freezing air. The sound of shepherds' whistles piercing the silence. The clash of cymbals. To the American soldiers, huddled in the dark, it sounded like the soundtrack of a nightmare. This was psychological warfare. The Chinese used the noise to coordinate their movements, but also to terrify the enemy. To let them know that they were everywhere. And they were everywhere. The attack did not come from the north alone. It came from the west. It came from the east. And, most terrifying of all, it came from the south. The back door had been slammed shut. The road home was cut. The Battle of Unsan became a chaotic, swirling melee. The Chinese soldiers did not fight from a distance. They rushed in. They got inside the American perimeter. Suddenly, the battle wasn't happening in front of the soldiers. It was happening among them. It was hand-to-hand. Bayonets against knives. Grenades thrown into command tents. The darkness rendered the American air power useless. The mighty artillery could not fire without hitting their own men. The sky was lit up by the tracers, red and orange lines of death crisscrossing in the night. The explosions of mortars turned the frozen ground into shrapnel. Confusion reigned supreme. Units were cut off from one another. Commanders lost contact with their platoons. Men shouted passwords into the dark, only to be answered by the muzzle flash of a submachine gun. In the center of this hell was the 3rd Battalion. They were the rear guard. And they were doomed. As the main force of the regiment tried to break out, to fight their way back south through the roadblocks, the 3rd Battalion was left behind. They were completely surrounded. They formed a tight circle, a small island of desperate resistance on a low hill. They were pounded by mortars. Wave after wave of Chinese infantry assaulted their position, blowing those haunting whistles as they ran. The men of the 3rd Battalion fought with the courage of the damned. They fought until their ammunition ran dry. They fought until the barrels of their machine guns glowed white-hot and then jammed. They fought with entrenching tools and rocks. They gathered the wounded in the center of the circle, trying to protect them with their own bodies. But there was no rescue coming. The relief column, a task force sent to break through to them, was stopped cold by the burning roadblocks and the storm of enemy fire. The commanders had to make the hardest choice in war. They had to turn back. They had to leave the 3rd Battalion to its fate. Throughout the long, freezing night, the perimeter shrank. The screams of the dying mixed with the bugle calls. The sheer number of the enemy was overwhelming. It was not a battle anymore. It was a massacre. The 3rd Battalion ceased to exist as a fighting force. They became known as the Lost Battalion. Over 1,000 men were killed or captured in that valley. When the sun finally rose on November 2nd, it illuminated a scene of apocalyptic destruction. The Valley of Unsan was a graveyard of machinery and men. The mighty tanks, the symbols of American industrial power, sat silent and burning, their turrets twisted, their tracks broken. The ground was littered with the debris of a shattered army. Helmets. Rifles. Letters from home that would never be delivered. The survivors who managed to escape stumbled south, dazed, frostbitten, leaving their equipment behind. They were not the same men who had driven north just days before. They had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had looked back. The Battle of Unsan was not the biggest battle of the war in terms of sheer numbers. But its impact was seismic. It was the shockwave that shattered the illusion of victory. It was the moment the United States realized they were not fighting a police action against a crumbling regime. They were fighting a massive, modernized, and fanatical army from a global superpower. The dream of being home by Christmas died in the frozen mud of Unsan. The general's maps were useless now. The strategy was in ashes. The war had reset. It would go on for 3 more bloody, brutal years. Unsan remains a lesson written in blood. A lesson about the danger of underestimating your enemy. A lesson about the fragility of certainty. And a lesson about the terrifying suddenness with which the tide of history can turn. On that cold November morning, the world woke up to a new reality. The dragon had arrived. And the long winter had only just begun.